Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Ben Burge and Stefan Bertram. Um, and I was given a reminder this week that before agreeing which one we should do a video about, I should really read the essay. Because I started reading. I just was like, okay, there's a Marxism thing. It's with an argument, probably, and maybe me and Ben will even disagree, and that'll be fun.
Sure.
I set up the thing and sent it to Ben, and then started reading. And I was like, oh fuck, it's about dialectics. I don't want to talk about dialectics. But maybe it's good because, like, I just really, I mean, the problem is, on I don't really have time for dialectics, but
Yeah.
it would be good if I did because that would make for a more interesting conversation, I think.
Yeah. Um, well, look, I mean, it's useful for various purposes. You can break bricks.
Very true.
Yeah, this has been a very strange week. So I just got off the phone with my mom, and I asked her a question I never thought I would ask my mother, which is, do you know who Amy Therese is? Because
That's dialect. No, it's not. It's a alpha bunga bunga. What's it called? Sublation, maybe. Return in a higher form.
that's
Amy,
dialectical. Yeah.
Amy Therese versus the K Hive 2020 has returned in 2024, and now she's a demented Nazi.
In an altered form. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's amazing that, like, I have lived long enough to see Amy Therese become an issue in the American presidential election.
Who's your VP pick? Wait,
Sorry.
were you the one that said that it should be Bernie Sanders?
I am the one who said it should be Bernie Sanders. That's yeah, this is like, this is one of those things that, like, I know it feels trollish to come out with this this take, and I certainly understand that it's not happening, but I actually think it does have the virtue of being correct for what that's worth. That
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, in current American politics, what is the point of a VP?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the point of the VP is a couple things. One is that on this sort of strange Kremlinology level, it signals things about the main candidate, right? That, like, think this, right? They pick me. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion right now about if Harris picks Governor Shapiro, that's like, that seems like it could be very bad in terms of, like, signaling to all of the uncommitted voters that no, fuck you, we're just going to keep doing it, as far as Israel-Palestine goes. So, like, it sends those kinds of signals. Theoretically, of course, the president could die, and then they'd be president, and then I think on the most immediate level, because obviously VPs do sort of get get like their share, like, get tasks to do within the administration, that happens, but it's also a somewhat pointless job most of the time, right? That's the famously, right? That this is, like, why, like, LBJ was so immensely frustrated after the years of running the Senate to be consigned to this position, that it's almost purely ceremonial, unless you get as lucky as LBJ did. And
well, I mean, as lucky as Kamala Harris,
or as lucky as Kamala Harris, absolutely.
who's
But
managed to go from like sixth in the 2020 primary to probably becoming president.
Yeah, well, in the 2020 primary, she was, she dropped out before a vote was cast. So, I mean, which is actually pretty impressive, because
Okay, so she did as well in the 2020 primary as I did.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So, she was probably residually on some ballots, so she got technically some votes, but yeah, she'd officially dropped out of the race. Yeah, so because which is like also amazing how badly she fucked up the 2020 election because um, if you were reading, like mainstream media things in like summer of 2019, she was like the presumptive frontrunner. It's like, oh, it's probably going to be Kamala. And then she performed so badly, right, in polling, by the time that the actual voting started, that she dropped out to save herself the embarrassment, which is, which actually does tie into the Bernie as VP argument, because part of the reason is that, she, I think she's kind of a political chameleon. Like, I see no evidence that she has strongly held principles of any kind. And she, so,
Did you see a thing about Israel from like 2018 or something?
oh, what
Someone
did
asked like, "Why do you support Israel?" And she's like, "I don't know. It's just a vibe."
know?
Like more or less exactly those words, where she's just like, "It's just like a feeling. I've
Awesome.
got no reason to do it, but I do it because it's a feeling inside of me."
Awesome. Yep. There you go. No reasoning required. Uh,
It's into a
which,
robot sometimes, by the way.
yeah. So she, like, her whole thing, right? Because she was attorney general before, and her whole selling point had been what a tough prosecutor she was. And then, even before George Floyd, like even in like late 2019, um, BLM was already a big enough deal that was sort of no longer a good selling point. And, she was in the Senate by this point, and she was kind of trying to tack left at that point. So as hard as this is to remember, there was a point where Kamala was actually like a Senate co-sponsor of Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. But then when she decided to run for president, it was one of these things that's like, I don't know. I mean, the show Veep has been mentioned by many, many people in connection with Kamala, that it was one of those things that was trying so hard to be clever. It was just sort of profoundly stupid that that when she was ready for president, she was trying to have it both ways and ended up pleasing exactly nobody, because she was like, okay, how can I be just left enough that I can capture some of the, fire from the like 2016 Bernie run, but also just centrist enough that I seem very safe to donors. And the result was just this mess that was pointless and pleased nobody, right? So she was like, well, I still support Medicare for all, but by which I mean, and then, you know,
Pell grants for underadvantaged business owners in the first 3 years or whatever.
yeah, exactly, right. That's like, yeah, we'll give healthcare to we'll give healthcare to everybody who's a Pell Grant winner who started a business in a minority community for at least 3 years and has brown eyes and cleft foot. Yeah, it like her explanation of what she meant ended up being like, well, that sounds a lot more like the public option, but a really convoluted way of doing it. That say, well, the way that for Medicare Advantage, there's the, private companies can offer plans to compete within that. So what if you looked at this just the right angle? We could do that, but for like everybody. So technically it would be Medicare for all, but I just don't mean what everybody else in the world means by that combination of words, right? And I'm still clearly retaining the existence of the private insurance industry. So it was completely ridiculous. I mean, her big moment in the 2020 campaign was when she did this like very obviously pre-planned hit on Biden for opposing busing in the 70s, that like so obviously pre-planned that like kind of the microsecond she'd said her line at the debate, the Harris campaign was selling t-shirts that, said like, I was that little girl on the bus or whatever. And then like the next day, some reporter finally thought to ask her what her position was. It was like kind of the same as Biden's position. So it was, that was kind of very representative of the 2020 campaign. So she sort of triangulated herself into total pointlessness, ended up, not actually having a lane, having to drop out. Then she was rescued, from obscurity, from the obscurity to which she would have sunk back into by Biden picking her as VP, which is sort of repeating the Dem cycle, because Biden himself would have been a totally forgotten footnote to the 2008 campaign because he did so badly. If Barack Obama hadn't decided that, he had exactly the kind of non-threatening old white guy vibes that he needed as a
And
running mate.
now the Dems are just going to do one white, one black for the rest of history, I assume.
I guess, yeah. And so now, Kamala Harris in 2020 had exactly the sort of not an old white guy vibe that Joe Biden needed as the VP. And so, and then Biden's brain stopped working to the extent that it did, and she became the nominee. And now, again, her history is she's just kind of this like weird chameleon politician creature with no clear principles. And so she could, if she really wanted to, she could pivot in any number of directions now. And I guess they'd all be about equally convincing because, like, what is she? But
I mean, that just reminded me that the other thing that's been happening this week is there clearly is a person with strongly held beliefs in the presidential race, JD Vance. And he's been telling people about these beliefs, and everyone hates them.
yeah, right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think Vance is, the whole thing about JD Vance is that he's trying to do, like, if you watch a speech at the RNC, which was just the whole thing was just a festival of bizarreness, right? I mean, Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt while screaming about how they tried to shoot Trump. But if you watch Vance's speech, he's, Vance is trying to sell this line of pseudo-populist bullshit where he talks about all of this very real social decay, deindustrialization, the opioid crisis, housing, and then doesn't actually have any particular solutions to it except, like, I don't know, round up and behead all the immigrants. And I think that could actually be a terrifyingly effective pitch in the right hands. I think it's just we all kind of dodged a bullet that JD Vance is such an obviously strange discourse goblin that he's just not an effective messenger for what he's trying to do. So like I said, if Harris did, and there's every sign she's not going to do this, right? Which I think some people are a little unclear on. That when I write an article in Jacobin saying that somebody should do something, that's not me predicting that they will do it. In fact, I think more often than not, I think that things that people say in Jacobin should happen are indeed not the things that happen in the world. More's the pity. But, if she did sort of do this left populist pivot, then picking Bertie would prove that she was very serious about it. And because, you're putting Bernie Sanders' heartbeat away from the presidency. And in an immediate sense, what it would do is even if the job of the vice president is totally pointless in between campaigns and presidential deaths and brain failures, that in the immediate sense, what it would mean is that Bernie Sanders got to debate JD Vance, which as a fan of, watching debates, I would really enjoy. So, I would like that to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I think that it's going to be, Waltz or Shapiro or Kelly.
Walz is okay, right?
Yeah, I think out of the bunch of them, he seems fine.
It's funny because he's not a Democrat. He's in the Farmers Party or whatever.
Oh yeah. So that's the Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, it's just what they're called. The Democrats are called in that state, right?
Yeah, because
it's the same as like the Labor and Co-op thing here.
Yeah, exactly. Once upon a time, that was actually a third party that was actually like a very successful state level third party, and then they just got reabsorbed into the Dems, and now the Farmer Labor Democratic Party is just what the Dems are called in Minnesota.
What does all this have to do with dialectics, Ben?
Everything has to do with
Everything.
dialectics.
Well, as we know, dialectics can be used to describe everything, especially like quantum physics and stuff.
Yeah,
So they obviously must describe all the stuff we've been talking about too. And if we can't see that, it's just our intellectual failing.
exactly. Yeah, dialectics is about everything, and it helps if you're a little bit confusing about how you talk about everything. That's more dialectical. Uh, yeah. So David Harvey wrote this book that I can't hold up to illustrate right now because it's in the other room, called A Companion to Marx's Capital, which I don't know if you've read it. Okay. I actually think it's worth reading. Like overall, I like the book. It's, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you've ever seen Harvey's, Capital lectures on YouTube, it's just that written down, more or less. And it's a useful book. It's accessibly written. I actually do think he has some smart and insightful things to say about capital at various points over the course of the book. But also there's this passage in there that's driven me crazy for a long time, and I thought I would write something up about why. And incidentally, since the question will inevitably come up, I have extended the invitation for the man to chat with me at some point. We'll see. We'll see if that ever happens. He does. The David Harvey Twitter account follows me, but I'm also not clear if that's actually run by David Harvey. So
Right.
I sort of suspect that it's not. But I sent a DM to that account anyway to ask. So we will see. But yeah, he is. So he's talking about as you said, dialectics. He says that when he's explaining how he's going to be reading Capital, he says that you have to understand it dialectically, and says there are people who he says some stuff about dialectics. He says, well, there are people, including some Marxists, who would disagree with this, and he mentions G.A. Cohen, John Romer, and Robert Brenner, who honestly I think probably doesn't quite belong on that list. I mean, he's definitely adjacent, but slightly different, slightly different deal. But and he says that these people are analytical Marxists. Sometimes they even like to call themselves no bullshit Marxists, and they try to strip Marxism of the dialectics, and that is, and he sort of says instead they prefer to turn Marx's argument, convert Marx's argument into a series of analytic propositions or a causal model of the world. Uh,
Which is you point out, especially the last one, is like, well, that sounds good.
yeah, yeah. All of these things he's saying sound good. I mean, he used the word positivism, and I'll just make my usual gripe, but I think it would actually be legitimately a little unfair to give Harvey too hard a time about this because the sin is so widespread. But lots of people in the humanities and social sciences, when they use this word positivism, I have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. Like, it's sometimes it almost sounds like they mean like what I was trained to think that word means, like logical positivism, but that's clearly not quite it, because it's so often used to apply to things that diverge too much and too obviously from that. And so oftentimes it just feels like math and data. Um, but
You were going robot-y again, though.
oh no, let me try something here. Gonna okay. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to close as much stuff as I possibly can to see if that helps. Um,
Your image got slightly better, so maybe it did.
okay, hope so. Um, but in any case, it's yeah. I mean, I just don't I just don't know what that's supposed to actually mean, right? You know, positivism. Um, so, oh, sorry, I just saw MIDI Doctor says pretend for a second we don't know what logical positivism is. So, logical positivism is a current within early 20th century analytic philosophy associated with uh, Carnap, the Vienna Circle. A.J. Ayer is the sort of main English language exponent. He wrote a book called Language, Truth, and Logic. And logical positivism refers to a cluster of views, but the sort of classic form is verificationism, which says that um, anything that's not either sort of true by definition or false by definition, or it's sort of clear what it would take to prove whether it was true or false, is just meaningless. Um, and so there are all sorts of exciting consequences that, like classical logical positivism, follows from this, like a lot of traditional philosophical questions are meaningless pseudo questions, uh, because there's nothing that would count as like evidence for any answer over any other answer, so it's just meaningless. Uh, that A.J. Ayer goes so far as to say that, taken as like propositions trying to describe the world, that ethical statements are meaningless. So
Mm.
he says, really, since there's no meaningful description of the world because there's nothing there'll be evidence for or against them. The only way to understand what we're doing when we make ethical statements that doesn't just make it nonsense is that they're just expressions of our emotional attitudes. So he famously says that when you say murder is wrong, that's really just a way of saying boo murder. So that's
Which is one of the rare philosophical views which kind of like, I don't know if it's disproven, but it's pretty close to that because of the
yeah,
embedding.
yeah. Well, because certainly that kind of classical logical positivism that I was just describing notoriously has a problem, which is that if you say any statement that's not a tautology or a contradiction is either verifiable or meaningless, okay, is that a tautology? Better not be a contradiction because that's false. Is that a tautology? Is it verifiable? If so, how do we empirically verify it? Or it'd be really weird if the statement of your own view was just meaningless according to your view, right? So there are ways you can try to get around this, but that is notoriously a pretty big problem for the classical version of the view. There are various ways that you could try to water that down to some extent and still say something that looks like a version of this, but
Or
more or
just saying like that's the proposition we're starting off with. Don't worry about it.
yeah. Well, that's my favorite move in philosophy. Don't worry about it. So, yeah, this is, in any case, it's extremely difficult to find logical positivists out in the wild. Twitter user Liam Bright, sort of calls himself one. I'm not totally clear on how serious he is about that. But in any case, it's, I just don't. Yeah, that's a view that like almost nobody actually holds anymore. It's notoriously has all these problems. And when I see people in various humanities and social sciences fields throw around the term positivist, sometimes it almost feels to me like they're talking about that. That's like, or something that's like in the neighborhood of that. But then they
I mean, I
clearly,
think the generic social science meaning of positivism is the idea of like scientific positivism, which is basically saying that like you do science and you get true facts about the world, and it's good and it works.
okay, well, as you just described it, that sounds, okay. Like, You
Yeah, I mean,
know,
it sounds pretty okay if you don't work in like a social science department or like an anthropology department, which has been infected with interesting ideas.
okay, yeah. Because I mean, like, look, just saying science is good and it works. It's like if that's positivism, then sign me up. It sort of often I saw Jonas Teal say on Twitter that he sees like textbooks in his academic studies that use the word positivism. They'll say these things that like sort of seem like obvious straw men, like you never have to worry about anything except for data or something like that. It's like, well, that's nobody thinks that, right?
Sociological positivism is the view that by observing social life, scientists can develop reliable and consistent knowledge about its inner workings.
Okay,
That's very controversial in social sciences, Ben.
apparently. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like all the definitions of positivism either seem like silly straw men or just like obviously correct, right? Like if that's what it means, then we should all
Or
be
like
positive.
at least fine.
Yeah, like just totally unobjectionable. Yeah. Um. So yeah, it says there are people who want to turn Marx into a positivist model builder, so that, and then like the end of that sentence is like, so that this model can be tested against empirical evidence. It's like, well, hold up. Do you not want to test your beliefs against empirical evidence? That seems bad, right? Like that seems like a good way to end up believing a bunch of things that are false. And like I have no problem saying that, in any sort of complicated argument such as the one Marx gives in Capital, that some premises are purely conceptual, right? And rather than empirical, that's fine, right? But
There's a fucking load of numbers in there too, and not just like made up ones of like take it to be the case that linen is X times this of that, but like lots of just statistics.
yes, there are a lot of statistics, and the statistics seem pretty important to Marx. And he has yeah, I mean, I just finished like an hour ago teaching the class on the first four sections of the working day chapter, and he spends a lot of time in there going through factory inspector reports about the number of minutes that the uh, mill owners take out of people's lunch and dinner breaks, and how what that adds up to every year. And again, that like it does seem like quite a few of the most important claims in the book, like in that chapter, for example, seem to be very straightforwardly empirical. Like one of his
And it's like, if you established actually that Marx is wrong in the sense that workers don't have like loads of their surplus value exploited, they just have like a
yeah,
little tiny bit.
yeah,
Even if it's still true, it just becomes a lot less forceful than what he's arguing, right?
yeah, right. It becomes a lot less interesting. I mean, one of the key claims in that chapter, certainly in 10.2, uh, is that part of what makes capitalism different from earlier forms of class society is that you have this boundless thirst, he calls it, for surplus labor time. So, you know, according, Marx's analysis says, look, all class societies have necessary labor and surplus labor, right? In any class society, the immediate producers, whether they're serfs or slaves or proletarians or whatever, are spending part of the day working to meet their own needs, doing the labor that's necessary, imposed necessity of, um, engaging in the labor process to turn what you get from nature into human use values. But then part of the working day in any class society is spent on surplus labor time. In other words, laboring to enrich the ruling class. Because if you have a ruling class that's not working, then part of the working time of people who are working is spent producing the stuff that goes to the ruling class. But Marx says in that the distinctiveness of capitalism comes from one of the sort of importantly distinctive things about capitalism when you think about the length of the working day is that under capitalism, production isn't just for, use value, right? It's for, you're producing for the market. And so in, under capitalism, you get this boundless thirst for surplus labor time that you don't in earlier forms of class society, because if you're a serf and you're just producing, like, your surplus labor time, what you're producing is the stuff that the lord and their family and their retainers will actually use, then even if all those people insist on being kept in a really extravagant lifestyle, comparatively speaking, that's a relatively modest demand for surplus labor time, because all you need to produce is the use values that all those people are going to actually live on. Whereas under you're producing, for, not just the sort of immediate consumption of the ruling class, but for them, reinvesting, what you're producing, right, in that MCM process, right, money becoming commodities, becoming more money, and that this produces this boundless thirst, right? So, and he makes this really interesting point that you have these transitional forms where you have the world is capitalist enough that you've got a global market. So, which presumably you don't really have much of a global market if most people are serfs or slaves or whatever, because those are categories of people who, most of their consumption doesn't come from the market, right? They're making their own stuff, that they're living off of. So you've got enough capitalism that you've got a world market where presumably most consumers are going to be, free laborers. But you still have these residual pockets of earlier modes of production, slavery, serfdom. And then, he points out that when you have that situation, then you end up getting these residual pockets, these earlier modes of production, but they're actually producing for the world market, right? They're producing for MCM purposes. So like the classical thing would be like slavery in the American South or pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue, where, the slaves aren't just producing to keep the slave owners in fancy gowns and mint juleps. They're producing, for MCM purposes, or even like he goes into all this stuff about the Danubian principalities, like in Romania, where, they're at a certain point, they're actually like the serfs there producing for the world market. And under those circumstances, you start to get these like crazy levels of, you start to get that boundless thirst for surplus labor time. So like the Corvée code in the Danubian principalities has this like fine print in a credit card agreement's worth of nuance about how to interpret the traditional feudal array, feudal obligation that, serfs do 14 days a year of corvée labor. And by the time they've reinterpreted it, those 14 days are like 6 months. And similarly with slavery in the American South and pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue, if you're, you're not just trying to meet the needs of the slave owners, their personal, consumption, no matter how over the top, you're trying to relentlessly produce, coffee and sugar to sell back in France, then, that's where you end up getting just this insane business model where, you just will die within 5 years and, be replaced by new imports, because, you've got this voracious thirst for more surplus labor time, which then Marx's claim is then we're going to see exactly the same thing playing out within English factories, which is how he spends most of the chapter documenting that process. And, he says ultimately the only way of getting around this is to, have this all powerful legal barrier. So look, these are all empirical claims. I mean, if you went back and did some historical research and showed that actually people tried to lengthen the working day just as much in, I don't know, ancient Mesopotamia, as they did in these situations you're talking about, that would actually show that an important claim Marx was making was wrong. Or if you showed that, like, oh, here's a society where we abolished all of the laws against extending the working day, and it nevertheless turned out that, like, the workday averaged about 8 hours, because that's all that's all anybody ended up agreeing to in employment contracts, then that would show that Marx was, like, really wrong about how a lot of this works, right? So yeah, I mean, it seems like, when you put all this together.
I'm just thinking about MCM, but it's like money, capital money, but it's like in ancient Bronze Age Egypt, so it's just
Yeah,
LP because it's just labor into pyramid, and labor, the pyramid doesn't produce any labor, so it's not LPL, it's just
yeah,
LP.
it's just LP
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right, exactly. And yeah, no, and then this business about analytic propositions. It's like, okay, again, I get to the point where, like, one of us is incredibly confused here, because you say you're converting Marx's argument to a series of analytic propositions. Like, well, okay, I know what a proposition is, I think, right? Like, unless you're using the word in some strange, eccentric, I'm not following. Position is like assertion. So, like, snow is white and Schnee is weiß are different sentences, but they express the same proposition, right? So a proposition is just a thing that can be true or false. So capital is a series of propositions. I mean, what else could it be but a series of propositions? And, like, yeah, Marx is saying, here's a bunch of stuff I think is true. And when Harvey himself, in the same passage, he calls it Marx's argument. Well, an argument is a series of propositions. That's what an argument is, right? Where some of those propositions are premises that give you the other propositions, conclusions. So, and then maybe it's that he's converting into analytic propositions. But my next question would be, what the fuck is an analytic proposition? I mean, it's like, certainly I assume we're not talking about, like, the analytic synthetic distinction here, because that wouldn't make sense, because so the classic analytic synthetic distinction is that a synthetic, like a analytic truth is a truth that's true because of the meanings of the words and just logic, right? Just logically follows from the meanings of the two words used. So, like, all bachelors are unmarried is an analytic truth that just, follows from the meaning of bachelors and unmarried. That, whereas, like, I don't know, 37% or whatever of marriages end in divorce is a synthetic truth. If that's true, it's true because of the way the world is. But
I had very strong feelings about this distinction at 19.
yeah,
And my essay saying that there's no such thing as the analytics, or there isn't a substantive analytic synthetic distinction, was like one of the two firsts I got during university.
that's really funny, because I was actually thinking about this earlier today. And I was thinking, okay, I suppose it's not uncommon for somebody in their 40s to think of the version of themselves in their 20s as a bit of a stranger, but I have a really specific, hyper nerdy version of that, which is that I can remember being a graduate student and being very, like, emotionally invested in thinking that Quine was right about the analytic synthetic distinction, and like all my friends who disagreed with that were wrong, and all this. And I really cared about this. I could remember, like, many hours, like, out at the bar with grad school friends arguing about this. And now it's like, I don't know, distinction seems like it's probably fine, and I certainly can't remember why I gave a shit. Like, but, like, that was very important to me at one point. So,
Yeah, I mean, even
Yeah.
now, I mean, just now I wouldn't think about it. I just think about it as like, oh, well, is this a tool? Is this a useful tool to distinguish between propositions? To which I can't imagine the answer is anything but sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very. Yeah, it's actually really funny. I don't know why. Uh, yeah, that is yes. For some fucking reason, standing Quine was very important to me at one point. But uh,
It's funny that we were like more philosophy nerds when we were younger.
yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah,
There was no point where me and Ben were out playing ball. We were just
right.
worse as we get younger. We're the most well-rounded individuals we've ever been right now.
Exactly. Yes. Um, so yeah, but look, I don't think that could be what Harvey means by analytic propositions, because I'm pretty sure none of those people he mentioned think that like everything that Marx says in Capital is an analytic truth, because that would be a really stupid thing to think. Because again, as we've just been saying, clearly a lot of his claims in Capital are empirical claims about, history and sociology. Um, so that's not it. So is an analytic proposition just a proposition that would please an analytic philosopher? I don't know. I strongly suspect that Harvey himself doesn't entirely know what he means by this. That he just sort of like analytic propositions is just kind of his name in his head for like the sort of thing that analytic types say. Uh, but
It's when you do Marxism, but it's cringe.
yeah. But then like all the rest of this, that is they want to turn it into a causal model of the world and then see if it matches the empirical data. It's like, well, I should hope so. I mean, what you're saying, that when you see a bunch of claims about history and economics, you're going to try to sort out exactly what those claims amount to, which things and which other things to happen. I hope so. I mean, that's like, if you're serious about trying to figure out exactly what Marx is saying, and then B, figure out whether it's true, then thinking very carefully about what this would mean in terms of causation, right? Which things cause which other things to happen. And then, you know, taking a gander at the empirical data to see if that's true just seem like exactly what one ought to do. So I suppose I don't really understand the accusation here. Enshe in the chat says, did Quine write bad prose on purpose? Perhaps. This is like,
It is really funny when people are like, continental philosophers are just obscurientists, but the people saying this are like big fans of analytic metaphysics, which is written in a style which seems if it's clear, but then you read the words and you're like, what the good fuck?
yeah, Quine really depends. It's like saying, is Nicolas Cage a good actor? It's like, well, are we talking about Leaving Las Vegas, Nicolas Cage, or are we talking about National Treasure, Nicolas Cage? Right? The difference matters. Are we talking about On What There Is Quine, or are we talking about Word and Object Quine? Because the latter, you are not the. I mean, I remember a friend of mine referring to that many years ago as analytic continental philosophy. Like, as you're reading Word and Object, it's like, man, this sounds like you're saying something interesting, but got me. Maybe that's unfair. It's been many, many years since I tried to read it, but that was my impression, at one point for sure.
As we've already established, whatever our younger selves thought was definitely right.
Yeah, exactly. So, um, whereas, like, yeah, that essay On What There is actually very well written. Like, there are like, I think the argument's very clear, but it's also like, I think there are lots of like vivid, fun turns of phrase throughout the essay. It's very good. And then somewhere in between, there's epistemology naturalized, which is yeah, maybe not quite as good as on what there is as far as the writing style goes, but it's getting there. It's like, I also think there's a little bit more wiggle room for interpretation about what Quine is actually saying in Epistemology Naturalized, but there's quite a bit of disagreement about that. But again, my younger self had very strong opinions about how to understand what he was saying there. But like, there are definitely some memorable turns of phrase in Epistemology Naturalized. But then, like, yeah, word and object, not so much. Famously, Quine, for some reason, wrote a memoir, and it is like the most dully written thing you can imagine. It's, I mean, he revised.
There, I sat there writing.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's actually called something like The Times of My Life. And I remember, like, the classic joke to make fun of that is like, the times of my life at time T1. Like, it's like, all right, you have for some reason spent my time recounting all of this stuff without the slightest effort to string it together into an entertaining narrative. So yeah, I don't know. I suppose maybe that means it is on purpose, or just over the course of his life, he decided to put much less effort into that. Your guess is as good as mine is. I mean, my theory of why Nicolas Cage sometimes seems like a very good actor and sometimes seems like the worst actor in the world is that every script he just sort of tries to give his all to, which means that if it's incredibly good script, seems like he's doing something really strange, but like that's actually him trying to, like, really, like, it's like, man, if he's gonna do this incredibly shitty remake of Wicker Man, right? He's gonna do it turned up to 11.
He's gonna be chewing the furniture, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know. In conclusion, all of the things that Harvey is saying that analytical Marxists do are things that, to the extent that I understand what he's saying, seem like they're things that you should in fact do. And in fact, the thing that he says that sort of tries to soften the critique, where he says, well, and I'm not even necessarily saying these guys are definitely wrong for always, but it's important to read Marx on his own terms. And so in the first instance, that should be, the dialectical terms. And it's like, so you shouldn't do any of that stuff I just said, right? That he says strips away the dialectics, the turning it into a causal model.
If you just read Capital, not having read other stuff, you'll have no idea what the fuck dialectics are, because they're never talked about.
Totally. Yeah.
A single time in Capital. So, like,
no, not at all.
Reading Capital in its own terms, unless you independently come up with the idea of dialectics is not going to feature in your reading.
Yeah, I mean, he has, I think the word dialectics comes up once in a preface. In, like, the main text of Capital, it literally never comes up. Now, I will say that there are things that you could understand as dialectical. There are as, like, if you are familiar with this stuff, there are things you will recognize as dialectical terminology or, dialectical concepts that definitely do come up in Capital. But, so you are, if you have read some of that extra stuff, that will enrich your understanding of what's going on. But also, though, like, when Marx, say, uses the word contradiction in this dialectical sort of way in Capital, then question is, okay, well, what are you going to do with that when you encounter it in the text? And it seems to me that what you should do with it is you should try to figure out exactly what he means by contradiction in that context, right? Is he saying that within some causal process, there are two things that, are pushing in opposite directions? Is he saying that, there's a conflict of, feature of, of a structure that, that generates conflicted interests? Is he saying that there's a structure that has multiple conditions for realization that can't be fulfilled at the same time, so the structure breaks down, right? Like, those are all things that contradiction can mean in context. And it seems to me that, if you want to get everything you can get out of capital, what you should do is, when you encounter one of those, you should try to figure out what Marx means. You should try to, in other words, translate his use of that language into the language of causes, effects, mechanisms, transform it, dare I say, into a causal model of the world that, one could perhaps even run wild at a later date and, try testing against empirical data. And so when Harvey says, well, in the first instance, don't do that because you have to understand Marx on his own terms, it's like, well, that just seems like advice to not try to get clear on precisely what Marx is saying so you could figure out whether it's true, but just to sort of keep things at this vague level that, well, he's called something a contradiction. I feel like I sort of know what he means by that. Good enough. Keep going. Which is, like, honestly, I think is genuine advice. No, you should try to think hard and think carefully about exactly what he means. When you're trying to figure out what some author means by it, it helps to rephrase it in your own words. It helps to spell it out as you try to explain what he means. It's like, okay, well, what would have to be true in terms of which things are causing which other things for this thing that he just said to be true? And, so, yeah, I guess I just think, like, if Harvey was consistently taking his own advice, I would not have recommended earlier that people read his companion to Marx's Capital, because, man, what a pointless guide to capital that would be if you weren't doing any of that stuff, right? Fortunately, Harvey very frequently neglects his own advice and does, in fact, explain what things mean in clearer language, sort of not just sort of keeping things at this vague level of Hegel terminology, but actually spelling out, what exactly is being claimed in terms of cause and effect and so on, as he should. And,
He triggered me, and then he didn't even bother to go through with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that's the sort of very odd place that I leave it, which is that, well, I guess I would say this just to make it a little bit more polemical. I think all of the worst parts of Harvey's Companion are the parts where he does take his own advice. And, he sort of does some Hegelese that is sort of supposed to be profound, but I have to say I don't get much out of it, right? Like, he draws a lot of circles to demonstrate, things being dialectically interrelated. But all of the best parts of Harvey's Companion are the parts where he does not take his own advice, but actually does all those things that he's sort of saying not to do.
Ben, we might have already done this on the show, but what would be your steel manning of dialectics and its place in Marxism? Like,
yeah,
for you, what does it mean and what do they do?
Yeah, in all seriousness, for all of my dislike of, the terminology of steel manning, did we do an episode on that? I don't remember.
No, we talked about it for like 5 minutes at the end of an episode.
Yeah. That's right. We previewed it, but yeah. For all my dislike of that terminology, I actually think that the position in the WLS book, the Eric Olnwright, Andrew Levine, Elliot Sober, Reconstructed Marxism, that I quote extensively in the essay, I actually think they get it about right? Which is to say, more or less what I just did, that, like, they, give that example about contradiction, say, like, okay, well, look, a dialectical contradiction is clearly not supposed to be a logical contradiction. It's not like you're saying two things that can't both be true. So here are some things that dialectical contradiction can mean and often does mean in the hands of Marx and other writers in that tradition. And say and even some of the look, I think that even some of what I was trying to get at in the dialectics essays that I wrote last year say, like, I think that this is language that, if you're like, what you're really talking about is, yeah, using dialectical language means that you're sort of using a certain bundle of metaphors and rhetorical techniques, and using these things can attune you to notice certain things that are helpful to notice. That it's that it's good to kind of keep an eye out for things being constantly in a state of flux and change.
Right,
For
because there's a distinct relation between contradictions and dialectics, right? And then contradictions are important to talk about, right?
Yeah, right. Well, that this is also just part of the ambiguity of the terminology, right? When you say dialectics or the dialectic or the dialectical method or etc., right? And whether all of these things are exactly synonymous or not is a fascinating question. But like, what are you talking about, right? And even if you read stuff like Engels in the Anti-Düring, where he's sort of he comes the closest to just sort of coming out and saying, "Here's exactly what I mean by this," right? He gives you these like three principles or whatever of dialectical thinking, and it's like, yeah, I mean, if you're sort of taking these as metaphysical truths about everything and always, then they're probably a bit dubious. But if you're saying that these are sort of patterns that you know come up a fair amount, so it's sort of analytically useful to be attuned to these things happening in certain kinds of historical and sociological contexts. And I have no quarrel with that whatsoever, right? It's like, yeah, that things tend to be in a state of change, right? Things change a lot. That in the course of things changing a lot, quantitative change can turn into qualitative ones. That even all that business about the negation of the negation is like, yeah, it's this sort of odd quasi-logical terminology, but what you're really talking about is that things happen that involves a certain sort of reversal, and then there's a certain sort of reversal, the reversal that doesn't take things back to where you started, but takes it to a new a new thing. And it's like, yeah, you're describing a pattern that I think can be usefully and accurately applied to thinking about various kinds of historical events and processes. And I don't really disagree with any of that. I just think that, like, again, about the line they take in the Reconstructed Marxism book seems right to me, that that, like, if you're any of these things, contradictions, right, in the dialectical sense of contradictions, or the negation of the negation in the sort of metaphorical dialectical sense of that phrase, not literally like the logical or semantic negation of negation. It's like, yeah, I have no problem with talking in any of these ways. I just think that, like, once you've done so, you should then be able to say, here's exactly what I mean, and spell it out in terms of clear claims about causes and effects and mechanisms.
Neat. That's exactly 1 hour.
Well, fair enough. So
and we did 15 minutes on Kamala Harris.
eh, eh, it's fine.
Well, I mean, as I said at the start, I didn't want to talk about dialectics.
Fair enough.
No, we did good.
We did good. Fair enough. So
What are you writing? What then?
I might. So I'm a little undecided. I'm definitely going to write both of these. I'm not sure which one is going to be finished next week, but one of them is about a essay that Mike Beggs wrote for Catalyst about feasible socialism, and then the other one is the other night I had dinner with somebody who I guess maybe will remain anonymous, is an academic and a journalist, but I don't know if this is a beef that he wants to start or not. But he told me, met him in Tijuana, had dinner, and he told me that about this book, the Amia Srinivasan, The Right to Sex,
No.
and he mentioned a particularly asinine argument that Srinivasan makes in this book, and as soon as he said, I was like, oh, I've got to pick up this Kindle right now because man, that sounds like philosophy for the people fodder. So I might be doing that.
Great. And if you don't like them, we can dig all the way back to steel manning.
Fair enough. Sounds good. Well, we will be back here this time next week to talk about one of those three things.
Bye. Wait, what? I need to press the intro again.